Welcome into the Fantasy Football Diagnostics Podcast, where we provide you with your weekly diagnosis of everything fantasy football. Whether it's season-long leagues, dynasty, DFS, or sometimes even IDP, we got you covered all year long. Next guest is somebody I met in the community a while back. We've been sharing each other's content for a while. He's someone who's going to help you dominate your fantasy league. He's the host of the Deep Dive Fantasy Football podcast. My guy is telling you to draft Tyler Boyd.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Absolutely. I just drafted him in Scott Fishbowl literally 5 minutes ago.
So definitely sticking with the brand. That is such an on-brand move right there. I'm talking about my man, Brandon Gabor. Brandon, man, welcome to the show, brother, and thanks for coming on.
Of course, man. Thanks for having me. I appreciate you letting me be the person to represent my Super Bowl champion Buccaneers.
And there you go. You already have it, ladies and gentlemen. You know which team we are talking about. You would have already known. If you listen to this in order, you've already made it through the first three teams in the division. We saved the best for last. I am sucking up to the guest here, but the Super Bowl champion, Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And as we look at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in 2020, they went from a team that missed the playoffs in 2019 to winning the Super Bowl. Things like that happen when you add Tom Brady to your roster. The Bucs had a phenomenal defense in 2020. It was actually pretty good in 2019 as well, but they were just putting a lot of bad spots by Mr. 30 for 30 himself, Jameis Winston. But heading into 2021, again with Tom Brady at quarterback and most of the roster returning, is it Super Bowl or bust for the Bucs in 2021, Brandon?
It depends on who you ask. If you ask me, I understand how difficult it is to repeat as a Super Bowl champion, and I've been in the in the horrible area as a fan of the Bucs for such a long time because we've been so bad. So I've felt rewarded with the Super Bowl win. I wouldn't say it's Super Bowl or bust, but when you look at the NFC, it's kind of tough to find a team that you think will go to the Super Bowl other than the Bucs. I mean, with the Aaron Rodgers questions and all these things, I actually have a sleeper, if you don't mind me throwing it out there. I think if the Bucs don't make it out of the NFC, the only person to knock them off could be the Rams. I think Stafford, you're going to see a similar effect that you saw with Brady. All his efficiency numbers, which I'm sure we'll talk about, jumped immensely with the weapon change and the coaching change in Tampa. And I think we're going to see the same thing with Stafford.
No, that's definitely a fair assumption there to make. I mean, like you talked about, they already have the number one. They already have the number one pass defense. They get an upgrade at quarterback if they can get more efficiency from the offense to match that defense. I don't think that's a bad. I don't think that's a bad take at all. But you talked about Tom Brady. We're going to talk about him now. Had a lights out first season under Bruce Arians, completing 65.7% of his passes, 4,633 yards, 40 touchdowns to 12 interceptions. He was the quarterback 10 in terms of fantasy points per game, just over 21 fantasy points. Going off the board is the quarterback 9 right now. He'll be 44 in September. Is there any reason to think he can't return a top 9 finish in 2021?
I don't think so, especially because if you look at the way that Tom Brady finished the season, and before people think, I'm just a biased Bucs fan, it's not the case. I don't actually draft Brady myself because I do think he will finish inside the top 9, but I like the upside of like a top 3, top 5 type of quarterback. And with as many people that run the ball now, Brady's not going to get to that. But I do think he will finish inside of where he's being drafted because if you just look at the back half of the year, once AB was added and once he started to understand the offense better and develop chemistry with Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, his yards per completion jumped to 12.4 yards per completion. Everything else held. He had the same amount of volume, the same touchdown rate, the same completion percentage, yet he jumped from a 10.7 yards per completion to 12.4. So if you extrapolate that over an entire season, he's going to be even better with yardage, and it's going to be really good for the receivers as well, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
Yeah, I'm with you on what you said about Brady. If he's definitely going to finish in that top 9, up there in that top 10, but with the amount of guys that run the ball, like I wouldn't even want to draft Brady in the top 9, even if just because there are guys even around him like a Ryan Tannehill who goes 10, or Jalen Hurts, who's going like 11 or 12,
Absolutely.
who on a weekly basis are probably going to give me a safer floor because of that rushing ability, and then also have those blow up games because of when those rushing games meet those blow up passing spots.
Yeah, I agree. Tom Brady's going to be one of those guys. He's a safe quarterback for you. You know he's going to be a quarterback one. He's not going to kill you on any week, and he's not going to kill you over the course of the season, but he's not going to give you the upside you want when it comes down to a fantasy championship or something like that. Because it's great to make the playoffs, but there's no point if you're not going to win it all. So you need somebody that has that high score potential that can just rip off, you know, 100 rushing yards or 50 rushing yards and still have a bunch of passing. So he's definitely somebody I'm not drafting.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to the running back position. And so Ronald Jones, I was a huge proponent of him last year, and I believe you were too, Brandon,
Yep.
going into the last year. He was definitely doing well for most of the year, had some hiccups in the pass game, but ultimately he did what he does best, which is tote the rock. 192 carries, 978 yards, 7 touchdowns, all career highs for the upcoming fourth year running back. This was all good enough to finish as the RB22 in fantasy points per game, just over 13 fantasy points in PPR leagues. Leonard Fournette didn't have quite a spectacular regular season. RB36 in PPR points per game, just over 10 points. Did deal with some injuries himself. Actually, both backs dealt with injuries. Fournette in the middle of the year, Rojo at the end of the year, and into the playoffs, where it kind of became Fournette's backfield in the playoffs. Averaged more than 100 yards from scrimmage and a touchdown in every game during that run. Fournette is the higher price running back at this moment. RB29, according to 4for4.com's multi site ADP. Ronald Jones going off the board as the RB34. Which of these guys would you rather have, Brandon?
I would rather have Ronald Jones, and I'm glad that you prefaced this segment with the fact that I was a Ronald Jones guy last year. I was absolutely, but the reason I would rather have Ronald Jones this year is because of the fact he's a little bit cheaper. Because I think they're going to be finishing very close to each other. If it wasn't for Ronald Jones getting hurt at the back end of last year, I think it'd be a completely different story. Because over the course of the regular season, Ronald Jones averaged 5.1 yards per carry. He had the explosion that you needed. And granted, he wasn't a great pass catcher. Neither was Leonard Fournette. And Leonard Fournette averaged 3.8 yards per carry over the regular season. Now, in the playoffs, he tore it up. But during the regular season, his vision was really bad. It started to get a little bit better towards the end and then improved in the playoffs. But none of that would have happened if it wasn't for Ronald Jones getting banged up. And it would be his backfield. He would absolutely be the guy going off the board. So, for those reasons, the fact that I really do believe he's a better runner than Leonard Fournette, and neither of them are going to have the receiving role now with Giovanni Bernard added, I think Rojo, after about week 4 or 5, will once again take over the reins as the main running back there, but it's never going to get more than like a 55-45 or 60-40 split between the two of them when it comes to carries. So I'll just take Ronald Jones because he's a little bit cheaper.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one as well. Ronald Jones being the cheaper guy, I kind of gravitate towards him, especially, they're going so close together in price. And Fournette was a little bit more efficient than Ronald Jones was in terms of the pass catching. I mean, had Ronald Jones was sub 70%
Yep.
in catch rate, which is pretty bad for a running back considering how close to the line of scrimmage they're usually getting the ball. But Leonard Fournette was at least reliable in that part of the game, and I think that when you have a guy like Brady, that's going to be important having someone he can rely on as a check down option. And I think if they were satisfied with Fournette, they wouldn't have brought in Giovanni Bernard like you had mentioned. So I think they're thinking they can still get a little bit more out of that role, which then it kind of makes you wonder, is this offense becoming, closer to what this backfield becoming closer to what it was in New England, kind of where you have guys with specified roles. And if that happens, not to say it's going to be a little bit easier. It will be a little bit easier to kind of, figure out, oh, well, this is a Ronald Jones game, or this is probably a Giovanni Bernard game. But I do think there's also the risk that it could also become a timeshare at any moment. Like it could flip on its head at any moment in time because Bruce Arians does have that in his DNA where it's like, no, Ronald Jones, you're just not playing well right now. I like what Leonard's giving us. We're just going to roll with him. So that risk is definitely present. And I think that's what kind of why I think I don't end up. I don't have any Leonard Fournette. I end up with a little bit of Ronald Jones, but I, for the most part, I'm pretty much steering clear of this backfield.
Yeah, I agree. I see that completely, and especially the fact that you might want to make the comparison to New England's running backs, and New England's running backs were somewhat serviceable for fantasy, but New England didn't have Antonio Brown, Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, Robert Gronkowski, and OJ Howard. So no matter how good this offense is, there are so, and it's great as a Bucs fan. I mean, I like it, right? But for fantasy, it's ridiculous how many weapons there are, and there's only one ball to go around. I know it's a cliche thing to say, but that's how it is. It's true, and I think it's going to be very difficult for anyone to be truly satisfied with any of the running backs. But if you had to pick one, I would take Ronald Jones.
Yeah, and I think I know what I said. I said I find myself not really targeting this backfield, and I say that from a standard redraft, not standard, but PPR redraft league, right? But in
Yeah.
best ball, I'm all in on Ronald Jones because I don't have to make that decision of when is he going to start because we know at any moment Ronald Jones can pop off a 98-yard touchdown run, and so I don't have to make those decisions. It's just going to happen when I draft him. So I think that's one thing to note that maybe these guys are probably more, better bets in a best ball league than your typical redraft league.
Yep. Absolutely.
All right, let's move on to the wide receiver position. You had talked about it, and this is an interesting one, right? You got the version of the big three here in Tampa Bay. Um, Mike Evans enjoyed his first season with Tom Brady, and while he had the lowest yards per game output of his career, he had the highest catch rate of his career at 64% when he previously averaged 56% in his career, and had a career high in touchdowns at 13. Also experienced his seventh straight 1,000-yard season, the only wide receiver to start his career with seven straight 1,000-yard seasons. Evans was the wide receiver 16 in PPR points per game at 15 and a half points. Chris Godwin disappointed a little bit coming off his breakout season. Only played 12 games, but turned 84 targets into 65 catches, 840 yards, and seven touchdowns. He was the wide receiver 15 in PPR points per game at 15.9. And then there's Antonio Brown, widely regarded as one of the best receivers of our generation, the wide receiver 3 in Tampa Bay. Only played in 8 games in 2020, but he was the wide receiver 24 in terms of PPR points per game at 14.6. He was on a 16-game pace of 124 targets, 90 catches, just under 1,000 yards, and 8 touchdowns. Not bad for a wide receiver 3 who will be 33 by the time this episode airs. And so he should be more comfortable after an off season with this team and in this offense. These guys are going off the board as the wide receiver 15, the wide receiver 18, and the wide receiver 43, respectively, according to 4 for 4. Any of these guys of value to you, and which one do you want, Brandon?
So I'll answer the second question first. If I have to take one between the top two, because obviously Antonio Brown, it's more of a value question because he's being drafted way later. Between Evans and Godwin, I'll take Evans. And the reason is because he has the most touchdown potential. All these guys can score touchdowns, but Evans has a clear role. He's that 50-50 guy, the I'm going to toss a ball up in the end zone guy. And that's why he was relevant as much as people want to hate on him for it, for a couple games where he had one catch for a touchdown because he has that clear defined role. Godwin is a supreme route runner and has super reliable hands. For some reason in the playoffs, he didn't, which was super frustrating. But in general, he's one of the most efficient wide receivers in the NFL. Antonio Brown is also a supreme route runner with super reliable hands. And I think it's more likely that Antonio Brown eats into Chris Godwin than he does into Mike Evans. So I would rather have Mike Evans because he has the higher touchdown ceiling. And I think his role is more clearly defined and will be more consistent from game to game. Because I think Evans will always be a lock for a certain amount of targets because now he has that chemistry with Brady. We didn't see that problem that he had early on in the season with the like one catch, one touchdown later on in the season. And Chris Godwin, Antonio Brown, it's going to be like Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp or something where it's going to be one person's game back to back to back. You know, it's going to change, just like you were talking about with Leonard Fournette and Ronald Jones. So I think they're all basically being drafted where they should. Antonio Brown should be a little bit higher. He's probably the best value in terms of where he's going to finish versus where he's being drafted. Right now, I have, since you talked about the points per game, you said Evans last year was 15.5, correct? I have him at 15.3. Godwin was at, you said 15.9, right? I have him at 14.5 points per game this year, and I have Antonio Brown at 12.8. It is important to remember that now having a reliable running back, Giovanni Bernard, in the receiving game, and now having OJ Howard come back in the tight end room, and having, young guys like Jalen Darden they just drafted, and Tyler Johnson, who made a super clutch catch that could have led to us winning the game versus the Saints in the playoffs, that there is more mouths to feed. So the trio is going to see a little bit less work. That's why I have them all kind of worse than they were last year, but they're still going to be very good.
Yeah, I think you're right there, right? Mike Evans has a defined role, right? He is that red zone threat. He's the big boundary receiver. He's gonna have that role, kind of solidified there for him. Where Antonio Brown, Chris Godwin, they kind of work similar areas of the field. Chris Godwin had a 10.28 out last year. Antonio Brown 8.9. So they're seeing similar targets there. And I think, like you said, they're kind of competing for those targets on a week to week basis. Where Mike Evans, when they get down to the red zone, it's pretty much him or one of the tight ends, right? So, or they're running the ball. So I think that Mike Evans, that touchdown potential, like you talked about, is going to be there. Whereas like Antonio Brown, Chris Godwin, they could very much end up with like the same stat line, and
Absolutely.
it wouldn't surprise me.
Absolutely. I have them very similar in my projections, actually. I have them 7 targets apart, 3 receptions apart, 180 yards apart, and 1 touchdown apart.
Who do you have with more targets?
The most targets I have at for Evans at 122, and then Godwin is at 116. Antonio Brown's at 109.
Okay. Yeah, I've actually got Brown getting 7 more targets than Godwin.
It's possible. It's possible for sure.
Yeah, knowing me, because I did this a while. I definitely did this a while ago with the Bucs, but I went back and looked at the games when all three played together
Yep.
and tried to see what the target shares were looking like around that point. And Antonio Brown must have been leading in targets at that point in time
Yeah,
during that stretch.
I think the tricky thing with that though is that Chris Godwin, if you remember, he broke his finger towards the middle or late part of the season. And so I think that definitely played a role in Antonio Brown being used as much as he was versus Godwin. And also, like I said, for some reason, Godwin was, I don't know if it was the pressure of the playoffs or what happened, but he was dropping balls. And I think, obviously that can lose some confidence of a quarterback like Tom Brady when you've got so many other weapons to throw the ball to. So that could have also been a contributing
You
factor to
know,
that.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I say this all the time, and I've said it a lot during this series. We remember a lot when players don't play for an injury, but we often forget when a player does play through an injury, and
Yeah.
that's one that I definitely forgot about, which is Chris Godwin with the broken finger. Because he did get surgery, missed a couple games, but then he had that splint removed like pretty quickly, and then came back. So, like
Yep.
you said, that could definitely have impacted him. And it definitely could have impacted, maybe we don't know what he looked like in practices. Maybe Tom Brady was like, I'm gonna go to AB on this one because I've seen Chris, he's a little banged up. But let's move on to somebody that Brady knows extremely well, and we were talking about Robert Gronkowski. It's funny, man. I'm a Jets fan. When Gronk and Brady were here, could not stand them. I mean, Gronk, he's cool. Like he'll always be cool, but him on a football field, I couldn't stand. But Brady just annoys the crap out of me. Couldn't stand him for anything. But now he's in Tampa. I don't care. He can do whatever he wants. I really don't care. Um,
But
go ahead. No, you were gonna say something?
yeah. Just before we finish, you gotta let me ask you a question or two about the Jets, since you say you're a Jets fan.
All right, yeah, no doubt. We'll do that. We'll do that. So Gronk came out of retirement, seemed like a shell of himself, but once that knocked the rust knocked off a little bit, seemed like he was back to being the Gronk or something close to it. Finished with 77 targets, 45 catches, 623 yards, 7 touchdowns. Was a tight end 9 in total fantasy points, averaging just over 9 points per game. Going off the board right now, Brandon is the tight end 14. Is there any value here with Gronk?
I don't think so, and I don't even think he's the tight end to draft. So this might sound crazy, but I had a theory last season in the offseason. We didn't really get to see it play out because OJ Howard got injured. But I think the fact that he got injured in it of itself kind of hinted towards my theory possibly being right. So we have a team here with the Bucs that are already going to make the playoffs, right? Super confident. They just won the Super Bowl. They know they're going to make the playoffs. And this is kind of what I thought was going to happen last year. Gronk is an older guy, gets banged up all the time. He's somebody that always shows up in clutch time. That means you want him to be healthy. You want him to not be banged. That's the same thing. I was going to say not be banged up. And you want him to be able to show up in clutch time. Well, the more you use him during the regular season, the more likely you won't have him in the postseason. And when you have as many weapons as the Bucs have, you do not need him at all during the regular season. So last offseason, my take was that OJ Howard was the guy to draft. OJ Howard was better and got used more than Robert Gronkowski until he got injured. Once OJ Howard got injured, that's when Gronk started becoming viable for fantasy. And now that OJ Howard is back, now that Gronk is another year older, and we know absolutely full confidence that we're going to make the playoffs unless Brady gets injured pretty much, why would they put a whole bunch on Gronk's plate when we have all these weapons? I don't think that they're going to. And I actually have OJ Howard out targeting Robert Gronkowski by almost 20 targets because OJ Howard's also in a contract year. He's super young. And I think that he is going to put in the work that he needs to, and especially with Brady during the offseason to gain that trust. And Brady seemed to like to throw it to him a couple times in the red zone here and there, despite all the weapons that we had in the first few weeks of the season. So I think OJ Howard's actually the guy to draft. But in redraft, since that's mainly what we're talking, I'm not taking either. They are the two lowest ranked tight ends out of everyone I've ranked so far. I think I've done like 22 teams. I've got like 10 teams left to go. And I just finished the Jets, which is why I have to ask you a question about the Jets. But yeah, I'm not drafting either for redraft, but OJ Howard for Dynasty, definitely a stash.
Yeah, I could see that happening, right? Because Gronk is, he's 32 years old. He's getting up there. OJ Howard, you know, he has all this potential that seems almost untapped. So, he's got that upside for sure. And from a redraft perspective, I'm kind of with you because if you are if you are weary of one of them, right? Like that those targets have to come from somewhere, and so they both end up being ranked poorly. So I mean, I think I have Gronk up at my tight end 14 actually. Um, but he's a guy that, at that point in the draft, I might like he's the guy that I find myself, if it's just a bunch of guys, I'm gonna take Gronk because he's Gronk. But like if I can get like a Noah Fant or if I can get even a Mike Gesicki, just somebody who has a little bit more upside, then I'm gonna go with those guys.
Yeah, we
But
also got to remember Gronk is the better blocker out of the two tight ends. So
this is
anytime that
true.
they need a tight end blocking, it's not going to be OJ Howard.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. That's a good point there. All right, Brandon. Let's move on. I got to ask you one last question, and then you could ask me this. You could ask me about the Jets. Um, how do you? I mean, I guess we already kind of know, but who's winning this division, and where is Tampa Bay finishing?
Tampa's winning the division, absolutely. I can't wait to see the train wreck that the Saints are going to be if they start Jameis Winston. And man, where are they going to finish? That's a tough one. I really don't see if Rodgers comes back, it'll be a different story. If he plays the entire season for Green Bay, which by the way, if Green Bay's smart, they trade Aaron Rodgers at the trade deadline to Denver because if you think about it, then Denver's already going to have a bad record, and then whatever picks they get from Denver will be higher in the draft order. That's just something I've been thinking about. But anyways, I don't think anybody can beat Tampa in the NFC except for maybe the Rams, and we might not even end up running into them. So I think the Bucs might make it back, but I don't think they're going to win. I have to be realistic. I'm always somebody that is super realistic. I always push my fandom to the side because that's kind of like just part of who I am, and I like to pride myself on that as an analyst. And I really don't think the Bucs are going to win it all again.
Yeah, I mean it's definitely tough to repeat. I mean it definitely helps to bring back, your entire starting
Absolutely.
lineup on both sides of the ball. That
Yeah.
definitely helps. But I'm not going to say he's getting older because that's never worked, but he's getting, the hairs in his beard are getting grayer. So, maybe Tom Brady slows down a little bit, but nah, I've got Tampa winning the division too. In terms of where they finish, I haven't really, put my brain through that exercise in terms of who's going to win and things. Definitely do that as we get closer to the season. Um, see how teams look in preseason, how some of these rookies look, and things like that. But I know you want to talk about the Jets. This is not a Jets podcast, but I will do it. I am almost responsible being not only just a fantasy football analyst, but the host of the Now We Have Liftoff New York Jets podcast.
Ah.
So I feel obligated to answer your Jets question. So yeah, I did notice before we start recording that this projections sheet of the Jets is your pinned tweet. So I did not get a chance to look at it before we started recording, but I have it pulled up right now. So what do you want to talk about? What's up?
So my hardest decision when projecting the Jets is who gets the most targets in the wide receiver room. I think it's definitely going to be Elijah or Corey, right? It's going to be one of the two. And man, you guys love Elijah. Like, I don't honestly, I'm gonna be honest right here. This is kind of putting myself in a vulnerable spot, but I don't think Elijah's as good as everyone thinks he is.
Mm, okay.
Like, I think he's good, but man, taking him over like Terrace Marshall, Rondale Moore, like a lot of the guys that they took him over, it makes sense. Like I talked about this on the podcast in my projections. It makes sense that they took him because he fits your team. But like his mold fits the team better than like a Terrace Marshall when you already have Mims and Davis, and maybe they're worried about like injuries for Rondale Moore. But yeah, you guys love him. So basically, who do you think is gonna lead in targets? Is it going to be Corey or is it going to be Elijah? Because I feel like Crowder's going to kind of hold him back in year one a little bit.
Yeah, so I think the way you have it with Corey Davis leading the league and leading the team in targets is the way it's going to be. When you look at Corey Davis, he was signed to a pretty good deal, 3 years, $37.5 million. He was signed to be the wide receiver one. And he had a pretty good year last year. We should have gone over 1,000 yards if he didn't get injured. So I definitely think Corey Davis does lead the team in targets, and then Elijah Moore. It's going to be interesting because a lot of people have pegged him as just a slot receiver only. But I think that's a bad narrative, and that's a
Yeah, I agree with that.
bad assumption to make because he's a guy that can play all over the field, and the Jets have talked about that. And they've been doing that with him. So I think he's a guy where Jamison Crowder being back doesn't hurt him as much as people think, but obviously doesn't help, right?
Mm-hmm.
Having those targets available would be good. But I think there's also what the one thing people are overlooking, and I tweeted it out a while ago, was that the Jamison Crowder restructure also makes Jamison Crowder more tradable and because he was harder to trade at
I like that. That's a good point.
he was harder to trade at 1 year $10 million, but he's easier to trade at 1 year $5 million. And especially as you get into the season and he's played some of those games and the Jets have already paid him some of those guarantees because it's a fully guaranteed 5 year deal. And so let's say, 4 games in the season, they could trade Jamison Crowder, and now Elijah Moore basically has a full time role to himself. So I think that's something that people need to consider when they do their projections. But I do have Elijah Moore as the second leading target getter. And I think the way I said it this last week when we broke down wide receivers and tight ends on the Jets podcast, and now we have Liftoff New York Jets podcast. But the range of outcomes for Elijah Moore is very wide, right? I think there's a world where he starts right out the gate, but I also think there's a world where they kind of ease him in and he's got to get this role. And then by end of season, they're like, oh, he's got this full time role. So I think the range of outcomes is probably somewhere between 500 to 550, 600 to 800, 900 receiving yards is probably where I would say with Elijah Moore.
Yeah, and you can tell I'm not like low on him in terms of my projections. I mean, I have him at 100 targets,
Mm-hmm.
66 receptions, almost 800 yards, 6 touchdowns. I think you guys are going to use him kind of like Debo in the rushing game, give him like a carry a game. Um, but yeah, Elijah and Corey were hard for me to figure out, but I knew that was going to be the 1 and 2, just didn't know the order. And same thing with Crowder and Mims. They're going to be 3 and 4. But if Crowder doesn't get traded, do you think he out targets Mims? Because like I know there's the the reports about Mims is not really picking up the offense as well or whatever. So
Yeah, I'm not really buying those reports on Mims, right? I think with Mims, he's a guy that when the pads are on, I think he plays a little bit differently, right? Because he's a guy that's known for his physicality. He's known for bullying DBs, winning at the contested catch point. So I think he's a guy that when the pads come on, that he'll shine a little bit more. But again, this, I think I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility, right? I said there's a range of outcomes, but if I had to lean towards one outcome being the true outcome, I think it's Elijah Moore is a starter out of the gate because he's been working as a starter in OTAs in minicamp. Corey Davis has been dealing with an injury, so Elijah Moore has been getting a lot of reps. Him and Zach Wilson have already built a rapport. So I think we're Corey Davis or Jamison Crowder and Denzel Mims are probably sharing that number three receiver role more
Mhm.
often than Elijah Moore is. So
Absolutely.
I think it's fair to have him. In terms of where Crowder and Mims, I would probably say maybe Crowder sees more targets because he's the more veteran receiver, and he's really good at what he does. Denzel Mims, I think, will probably be a situational receiver if it comes to
Mhm.
that, just because of his size and his deep threat ability and his red zone prowess. So I think. Um, maybe you'll see it played out that way, but again, it really depends on what happens with Crowder as the season plays out.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, no doubt, brother. No doubt at all. No doubt. All right, Brandon. Well, why don't you let everybody know where they can find you, what you're working on these days, and where how they can reach you, man.
Of course. So on Twitter, you guys can find me at Deep Dive FF, and feel free to DM me, comment anything. I'm always down for discussion. Also, I would say the one thing you guys should check out, completely free and everything, is my draft sheets with my projections. So I'll pull it up right now while I'm talking to you guys. I just added a new column. So I try and make this stuff like super. Uh, what's the word I'm looking for? where it has a bunch of different uses, right? So I have my quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end sheets all separate, but they're in the same link so you can see them all. And I have last year's stats and efficiency metrics for every player. Then I have my projections right next to it for every player. I have them ranked by my points per game, broken down into tiers. I have a risk rating, a potential rating, so like ceiling. And I just added today strength of schedule based off Fantasy Pros strength of schedule, and I'm putting it in there too. So it's like a great tiebreaker for if you're drafting, tier based, which is how most people should draft, right? So you can use like the risk and the potential and the strength of schedule to decide who you want to take from tiers. And then I also have consistency rankings, which I haven't put in there yet, but I do that every year. I do it myself. And then something called VORP, which is value over replacement, basically helps you make cross positional decisions. So like, should I take a running back or wide receiver? You look at the VORP, whichever number is higher, that's the position you want to grab right there.
There you go. Make sure you go check Brandon out. Make sure you go check out his work. Make sure you go check out his podcast. Dude is sharp. I've definitely been a fan of his work from afar for a while. I was glad to be able to get you on, Brandon, and talk some ball with you. This has been awesome, brother. So make sure you go check Brandon out. And everyone, hope you enjoyed it. And we will catch y'all next week as we break down the AFC South. Peace, y'all.